It was just a family portrait. Until experts were shocked to study the girl's necklace. Dr. Marcus Reed had examined thousands of 19th century photographs during his career at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Most arrived in donations from estate sales, attic cleanouts, or families looking to preserve their ancestors' images. But on a cold morning in February, one photograph made him stop mid-catalog. The image showed a black family of 4, formerly posed in a photography studio. The backdrop was painted to resemble a garden scene, common in 1880s portrait studios. The date penciled on the back read simply, 1889, Richmond, Virginia. The father stood tall in a worn but carefully maintained suit, his hand resting on an ornate studio chair. The mother sat composed, wearing a high-collared dress of dark fabric, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. 2 daughters completed the portrait. The older girl, perhaps 14, stood beside her mother in a somber dress with white collar detailing. The younger child, no more than 8 years old, sat on a low stool wearing a lighter-colored dress with small ruffles. Marcus had been cataloging these photos for 3 weeks, part of a collection donated by a Virginia Historical Society. Nothing unusual so far, just documentation of black families building lives in the years after emancipation. But something about this particular image held his attention. He reached for the magnifying glass on his desk and brought the photograph closer to the lamp. The lighting in the old studio had been good. He could make out remarkable detail for a photograph of that era. The father's calloused hands, the mother's tired but dignified expression, the older daughter's protective stance near her younger sister. Then he focused on the younger girl. She wore a necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small oval locket. It seemed incongruous with the family's obviously modest circumstances. The clothing was clean but showed signs of wear and mending. The studio setting was the cheapest option available. Yet this child wore what appeared to be a piece of fine jewelry. Marcus adjusted the magnifying glass, bringing the locket into sharper focus. His breath caught. There was something engraved on the locket's surface. Letters, maybe initials. He couldn't make them out clearly in the photograph, but they were definitely there. And something else. The locket seemed slightly open, as if it had been positioned deliberately to show that it contained something inside. Marcus sat back slowly, his mind racing. In his experience, details like this were never accidental. Families commissioning photographs in 1889, especially black families with limited resources, made deliberate choices about what to include, what to display, what to preserve for posterity. This locket meant something. He needed to find out what. Marcus immediately called his colleague, Dr. Jennifer Washington, who specialized in post-Civil War African American genealogy. She arrived within the hour, her curiosity piqued by the urgency in his voice. "Look at this," Marcus said, handing her the magnifying glass and pointing to the younger girl's necklace. Jennifer studied the photograph carefully, her trained eye moving over every detail. She examined the family's clothing, their posture, the studio setting. Then she focused on the locket. "That's unusual," she said slowly. "That's not costume jewelry. Even in this old photograph, you can see the quality. That's real silver, possibly even gold." "Exactly. Look at everything else in this picture. The father's suit is threadbare at the elbows. The mother's dress has been let out. You can see the line where the seam was moved. But this child is wearing an expensive locket." Jennifer leaned closer. "And there's engraving. Can you make out what it says?" "Not clearly, but I can see letters. And Jennifer, look at how the locket is positioned. It's slightly open, like someone wanted to show that it contained something." Jennifer straightened, thinking. While families didn't commission studio photographs lightly in 1889, it was expensive, especially for black families. Every element in this photo was chosen deliberately. So why would they make sure this locket was visible and partially open? Because they wanted someone to see it, to notice it, to ask questions. Jennifer picked up the photograph, turning it over to read the penciled notation again. 1889, Richmond, Virginia. "Do we have any other information?" Marcus pulled out the donation file. The collection came from Dorothy Hayes' estate. She died last year at 93 in Richmond. She'd been a schoolteacher, collected photographs trying to preserve black history in Virginia. Did the family provide documentation? Lists of names, locations? Marcus flipped through pages. Most were brief, just dates and locations, sometimes a surname. Then he found an entry that made his pulse quicken. Here, family portrait, believed to be the Williams family, Richmond, 1889, studio of Frederick Morrison, Clay Street. Note, inquiries made in 1940s regarding youngest daughter's identity. Jennifer looked up sharply. Inquiries about her identity? In the 1940s? That's 50 years after the photograph? Someone was looking for this girl. Or trying to find out who she really was. They stared at each other, the implications settling between them. This wasn't just a family portrait. This was a photograph containing a mystery that someone had tried to solve decades later and apparently failed. "We need to find the Williams family," Marcus said, "and we need to find out what's in that locket." Let's start with the 1890 census for Richmond. That census was destroyed in a fire. I know, but we have city directories, church records, property deeds. We'll find them. Finding the Williams family proved difficult. The surname was common in Richmond's black community, and records from the 1880s were incomplete. But Jennifer's expertise proved invaluable. She began with church records, knowing black families centered their communities around religious institutions. After 2 days searching digitized records from Richmond's black churches, she found something promising. "Marcus, look at this." She turned her laptop screen toward him. Mount Zion Baptist Church. Membership records from 1887. Samuel Williams, age 38, laborer. Wife, Grace Williams, age 34. Daughters, Ruth Williams, age 12. Sarah Williams, age 6. Marcus leaned forward. The ages match. If Ruth was 12 in 1887, she'd be 14 in 1889, the older girl. And Sarah would be 8, the younger girl with the locket. There's more. Jennifer scrolled down. In 1888, there's a note. Family inquiry regarding Sarah Williams' birth records. No documentation available. Child believed born approximately 1881. Exact date unknown. No birth records for the younger daughter. Unless she wasn't born to this family. The words hung between them. Jennifer continued reading. In 1889, the same year as our photograph, another note. Grace Williams reports Sarah's nightmares continue. Child speaks of the house with green shutters and asks for Mama Ruth. Grace seeks pastoral counsel regarding how to help child remember her true family. Marcus felt his skin prickle. Sarah was asking for someone named Ruth, but Ruth was the older sister's name. Or Ruth was someone else, her birth mother maybe. So Sarah Williams wasn't Samuel and Grace's biological daughter. Jennifer accessed Virginia State Archives. If Sarah was adopted, there might be legal guardianship documents. They searched for an hour, finding nothing. Then Marcus had another idea. The notation said inquiries were made in the 1940s about Sarah's identity. That's specific. 50 years later, Sarah would have been in her 60s. Maybe she was still alive, asking questions about her own past. Or maybe her children were. How do we find what happened to her? Death records, obituaries, cemetery registries? They divided the work. Marcus took death certificates from the 1930s through 1960s, while Jennifer searched newspaper obituaries. The sun was setting when Jennifer gasped. "Marcus, I found her." She turned her screen. It was a Richmond Times-Dispatch obituary, dated April 15, 1951. Sarah Williams. Peterson, 69, died peacefully Wednesday. Born in Virginia, exact date unknown, raised by Samuel and Grace Williams of Richmond. Married James Peterson in 1903, moved to Washington, D.C., worked as seamstress, raised 4 children. Mrs. Peterson spent many years searching for information about her early childhood and birth family, hoping to solve the mystery of her origins, survived by her children, who continue her quest. Marcus and Jennifer stared at the obituary. Sarah Williams Peterson had died in 1951, still searching for answers about her identity, and her children had continued that search. If her children were continuing the search in 1951, Jennifer said, some might still be alive. Sarah died at 69. If she had children in her 20s, they'd be in their 90s now. Marcus searched immediately. The obituary mentions 4 children but doesn't name them. Let me find James Peterson's death record. 20 minutes later, they had their answer. James Peterson died in 1958. His death certificate listed 4 children. Margaret Peterson Davis, born 1904, Ruth Peterson Cole, born 1907, Samuel Peterson, born 1910, Grace Peterson Brown, born 1914. They named their children after the Williams family, Jennifer noted. Marcus ran searches through public records and genealogy databases. Finally, he found something extraordinary. Ruth Peterson Cole, age 118, listed in the 2024 Super Agers Registry. She'd be 118, Jennifer said skeptically, but possible. And she's living in Silver Spring, Maryland, just outside D.C. Marcus picked up his phone, hands trembling. He called the care facility. After explaining his research, he was transferred to the family liaison, Carol Henderson. Yes, Mrs. Cole is one of our residents, Carol confirmed. Her mind is still sharp. She loves visitors, especially those interested in her stories. Could we visit? We're researching her mother's history, and we found a photograph that might be important. There was a pause. You should know Mrs. Cole has spent her entire adult life trying to solve her mother's mystery. She has boxes of documents, letters, research notes. She's never given up. We'd very much like to meet her. 2 days later, Marcus and Jennifer sat across from Ruth Peterson Cole. At 118, she was tiny and frail, but her eyes were alert. Her great-granddaughter, Keisha Williams, sat beside her. Marcus laid the photograph on the table in a protective sleeve. Keisha held it up for Ruth to see. "That's her," Ruth whispered. "That's my mother. I've never seen this photograph before." "Mrs. Cole," Jennifer said gently, "we're trying to understand your mother's story. Records indicate she wasn't born to Samuel and Grace Williams, that she was taken in when young. Can you tell us what you know?" Ruth nodded slowly. "My mother had few memories of early childhood. She remembered a big house with green shutters. She remembered a woman she called Mama Ruth. She remembered being put on a train, and she remembered crying for her mama." "Do you know how she came to live with the Williams family?" "She was found in 1884, about 3 years old, wandering near Richmond train station. She wore a nice dress and a locket." Marcus and Jennifer exchanged glances. "The locket in the photograph," Marcus said. "Yes. My mother wore it her entire life, never took it off. She said it was the only thing from her real mother." "Mrs. Cole," Jennifer asked carefully, "do you still have the locket?" Ruth smiled faintly. Keisha reached into her bag and withdrew a velvet pouch, opening it to reveal a tarnished silver locket. "We've kept it all these years." Marcus picked up the locket with gloved hands. It was oval, about an inch long, with intricate engraving on the surface. He could now clearly see what had been barely visible in the photograph. Initials. R.M. "R.M., Jennifer read aloud. "Not Sarah Williams, not connected to the Williams family." "Open it," Ruth said quietly. "Inside is the secret my mother could never solve." Marcus carefully pried open the clasp. Inside, he found two things. A tiny, faded photograph, barely larger than a postage stamp, showing a young black woman in a fine dress, and beneath it, folded impossibly small, a piece of paper. With trembling hands, he unfolded it. It was a birth certificate, handwritten in elegant script. Sarah Ruth Morrison, born March 15th, 1881. Mother, Ruth Ellen Morrison. Father, unknown, freeborn. The room fell silent. "Morrison," Marcus whispered. "Sarah Ruth Morrison. Your mother's real name." Ruth Cole closed her eyes, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "After 138 years, finally we know her name." Marcus photographed the birth certificate and the tiny portrait carefully. "Mrs. Cole, this changes everything. With your mother's real name and birth date, we can trace her family. We can find out what happened." "My mother tried for 50 years, Ruth said softly. "She searched records, wrote letters, hired investigators. She never found anything about Ruth Morrison or the Morrison family. It was like they'd vanished." "Records were poorly kept for black families in that era," Jennifer explained, "especially in rural areas. But now we have digital databases, combined archives, genealogy tools your mother didn't have access to. We can search in ways that weren't possible before." Keisha leaned forward. "What do you need from us?" "The locket, if you're willing to let us study it further. And any documents your grandmother or great-grandmother kept. Letters, notes, anything related to the search." "I have everything," Ruth said. "Boxes of papers and storage. My mother documented every dead end, every search, every theory. She wanted someone, someday, to finish what she started." "We'll finish it," Marcus promised. "We'll find out who Ruth Morrison was and what happened to her family." Over the next week, Keisha brought boxes to the museum, decades of Sarah's research carefully preserved. Birth announcements she'd collected from Virginia newspapers, census pages she'd copied by hand in libraries, letters to county clerks requesting records, maps marking locations she'd searched. It was heartbreaking to see the scope of Sarah's failed searches, but it also provided a roadmap of what had already been tried, helping Marcus and Jennifer avoid retracing the same dead ends. They started fresh with the birth certificate's information. Ruth Ellen Morrison, 1881, Virginia. Jennifer searched property records while Marcus focused on church registries and business licenses. 3 days later, Jennifer found it, a property deed dated 1879 in Henrico County. Land purchased by Ruth Ellen Morrison, free woman of color, 40 acres, payment in full. She owned land, Jennifer said excitedly. Ruth Morrison was a property owner. They'd found Sarah's mother. Now they needed to discover why she disappeared. With Ruth Morrison's name and property location confirmed, Marcus and Jennifer searched Henrico County records intensively. The 1880 census listed Ruth Morrison, age 28, as a seamstress and property owner, living with her mother Ella Morrison and infant daughter Sarah. A black woman owning property in 1880 Virginia, Marcus said. Just 15 years after emancipation, she must have been remarkable. They found newspaper advertisements from 1881, 1882 listing R. Morrison, fine dressmaking and alterations, Henrico County. Ruth had run a successful business, taking commissions from Richmond's wealthy families. But then the record stopped. No advertisements after 1882. No property taxes paid after 1883. Something happened, Jennifer said. Between 1883 and 1884, Ruth Morrison vanished. Marcus searched newspaper archives, going through hundreds of pages. Then he found it, an article in the Richmond Dispatch, dated September 14th, 1883. Tragedy in Henrico County. The home of Ruth Morrison, a free negress, was destroyed by fire Tuesday night. Miss Morrison is reported missing. Her mother, Ella Morrison, perished in the blaze. The cause remains under investigation, though neighbors report seeing men on horseback leaving the property before flames were discovered. Miss Morrison's young daughter, approximately 3 years old, has not been located. "Oi!" Marcus read it aloud, his voice tight with anger. "They burned her house," Jennifer said, "killed her mother, tried to kill Ruth and Sarah." A second article from October 1883 reported, "Investigation closed in Morrison fire. No evidence of criminal activity. Ruth Morrison presumed deceased. Missing child presumed deceased. Morrison property claimed by county for unpaid taxes and will be auctioned." "They covered it up," Marcus said bitterly. Jennifer pulled up land records. The property was auctioned in November 1883, purchased by Thomas Whitfield for $200, a fraction of its value. Whitfield was a local planter who'd owned slaves before the war. So Whitfield burned Ruth's house, killed her mother, then bought the property for almost nothing. And the investigation was closed without charges. They sat in heavy silence, understanding the pattern. Ruth Morrison had been successful and independent, a black woman who'd built something real. Someone had decided she was too prosperous, too confident. Someone had destroyed everything she'd built. But Ruth saved Sarah, Jennifer said. Somehow she got her daughter away, put her on a train with the locket containing her real name, the only proof of who she was. The question is, what happened to Ruth herself? They expanded their search beyond Virginia, theorizing Ruth might have fled. Jennifer checked church records in neighboring states, looking for any Ruth Morrison or Ruth M., seeking refuge. Finally, in First Baptist Church records in Washington, D.C., she found October 1883, provided sanctuary and medical care to Ruth M., freedwoman from Virginia, suffered injuries to hands and arms. Woman reports violent attack on her property. Church provided temporary housing and employment assistance. She survived, Jennifer said. Ruth Morrison made it to Washington. They traced her through city directories. In 1885, Morrison, Ruth, laundress, 412 K Street, NW. In 1890, a marriage record. Ruth Morrison married Thomas Freeman, a railroad porter. Ruth had rebuilt her life in Washington, working quietly, keeping a low profile. She'd taken a new name through marriage, Ruth Freeman, hiding from whoever had destroyed her Virginia home. But she'd never returned for Sarah, never reclaimed her daughter who lived just 2 hours away in Richmond. The question was why. Marcus and Jennifer searched First Baptist Church records more carefully, looking for any explanation of why Ruth Morrison never returned for her daughter. They found it in a pastoral note dated December 1883. Ruth M. inquired about reclaiming her daughter from Richmond. Advised against returning to Virginia due to safety concerns. Woman reports men who attacked her may be searching for child as well. Expressed fear that retrieving child would endanger child. Decision made to allow child to remain in safe situation with Richmond family until threat passes. Marcus read it aloud, his voice thick with emotion. She couldn't go back. If she went to Richmond, she'd lead the men who burned her house right to Sarah. So she gave up everything, Jennifer said quietly. Her child, her identity, her property, to keep Sarah safe. They found scattered references to Ruth Freeman through the 1890s. She worked as a laundress, lived modestly, never drew attention. She and Thomas Freeman had no children together. Then, in 1902, they discovered an extraordinary document, a letter preserved in the church archives, written in Ruth Freeman's hand. Reverend Jackson, I have learned my daughter Sarah married James Peterson and moved to Washington. She lives 5 miles from where I work. I have seen her from a distance. She's beautiful and appears happy. She has children now. I want desperately to tell her who I am, to explain why I left. But would it help her to know her mother is alive but lived all these years without contacting her? I am asking you to help me decide whether to reveal myself or remain silent. Your servant in Christ, Ruth Freeman. The pastor's response was written at the bottom. Sister Ruth, this is a decision only you can make. I will pray with you for guidance, but I believe your daughter deserves to know the truth. The truth, spoken with love, is rarely wrong. Marcus called Keisha immediately. Did your great-grandmother ever mention Ruth Morrison trying to contact her mother, Sarah? There was a pause. Actually, yes. Great-grandmother told me that in 1902, a woman approached her mother on the street in Washington. The woman called her Sarah Ruth Morrison. She told Sarah she was her mother, that she'd saved her from a fire, that she'd stayed away to protect her. What did Sarah do? She invited the woman to her home, They spent an afternoon together. Ruth Morrison told her everything about the property, the fire, the men who tried to kill them, about putting Sarah on a train with the locket. She explained why she'd stayed away, because she loved Sarah too much to risk leading dangerous men to her. Did they meet again? A few times, over several months. But then Ruth Freeman died of pneumonia in February 1903. Sarah mourned deeply. She kept the locket and wore it every day. She spent the next 50 years trying to document her mother's story, trying to prove Ruth Morrison had existed and been destroyed by racist violence. Marcus felt tears in his eyes. That's why Sarah had the photograph taken with the locket visible. She was creating evidence. And why inquiries were made in the 1940s about Sarah's identity, Jennifer added. Sarah was still searching, still trying to piece together her mother's story and get justice. Did she ever find justice? Marcus asked. No, Keisha said quietly. She died still searching, but maybe you can finish what she started. Marcus and Jennifer spent the next week compiling everything. Property records proving Ruth Morrison's ownership, newspaper articles documenting the suspicious fire, evidence of Thomas Whitfield's purchase of the property, Ruth's testimony preserved in church records, and Sarah's lifelong documentation efforts through the locket and photograph. Together, the evidence painted an undeniable picture. Thomas Whitfield had orchestrated an arson attack to steal Ruth Morrison's land. He'd killed her mother, tried to kill Ruth and Sarah, then purchased the property for almost nothing when it was seized for unpaid taxes. We need to present this publicly, Jennifer said, not just as academic research, but as formal documentation of racist violence and land theft. Marcus contacted a reporter at the Washington Post who specialized in investigative historical journalism. Within 2 weeks, the reporter had reviewed their evidence and tracked down Whitfield descendants. The article ran on the front page. How Virginia families were robbed. The systematic land theft that history forgot. The story detailed Ruth Morrison's success and destruction, Thomas Whitfield's violence, and the failure of legal systems to protect black property owners. It included the photograph of Sarah with her locket, the little girl who'd survived attempted murder and spent her life searching for her mother's story. The response was overwhelming. Descendants of other black families who lost property in Henrico County came forward. Historians investigated similar patterns across Virginia. Legal scholars discussed possibilities for restitution. And Ruth Cole at 118 finally saw her mother's story told publicly. My great-grandmother is at peace now, Keisha told Marcus. She spent her whole life trying to tell this story. Now the world knows. Now, Ruth Morrison is remembered not as a victim who disappeared, but as a woman who fought back, who saved her daughter, and who tried to get justice. But there was one more piece that needed to be completed. 2 weeks after the Washington Post article published, a civil rights attorney named David Richardson contacted Keisha. He specialized in historical restitution cases, helping descendants recover stolen property or receive compensation. Your great-great-grandmother's case is exceptionally well documented, Richardson explained in their first meeting. Marcus and Jennifer attended to provide historical context. We have property deeds proving Ruth Morrison's ownership, newspaper articles documenting the fire, evidence of Thomas Whitfield's fraudulent purchase, and Ruth's testimony. This is rare. Most cases lack sufficient documentation, but yours has everything we need. What are you proposing? Keisha asked. A lawsuit against current owners of the property, Whitfield descendants, seeking acknowledgement of the theft and either return of the land or fair compensation for its current value. Would this work legally? Keisha looked at Marcus and Jennifer. It's been almost 150 years. There's no statute of limitations on stolen property in Virginia, Richardson explained. If we prove the property was obtained through fraud and violence, descendants of the rightful owner have legal standing. The challenge is documentation, which you have. My great-grandmother spent her entire life trying to get justice for Ruth Morrison, Keisha said firmly. I'm not stopping now. The lawsuit was filed 3 months later. Keisha Williams, et al. V., the Whitfield Family Trust, et al. The complaint detailed Ruth Morrison's purchase in 1879, the arson attack in 1883, and Thomas Whitfield's fraudulent acquisition. The Whitfield descendants initially fought, arguing too much time had passed. But as Richardson presented evidence, property records, newspaper articles, Ruth Morrison's testimony, their position weakened. The turning point came when Richardson presented the photograph in court. He projected it on a large screen, zooming in on young Sarah's locket. This is Sarah Ruth Morrison, Richardson told the court. She was 3 years old when Thomas Whitfield burned her home and murdered her grandmother. Her mother placed this locket around her neck and sent her to safety. Inside was Sarah's birth certificate and a photograph, proof of who she was. Sarah wore this locket every day for 70 years, honoring her mother and preserving evidence of the crime. He held up the actual locket. This is not ancient history. This is documented theft, documented violence, documented injustice. The evidence is here, preserved by a mother's love and a daughter's determination. The courtroom was silent. 2 weeks later, the Whitfield Family Trust agreed to settle. They issued formal acknowledgement that Thomas Whitfield had acquired Ruth Morrison's property through fraud and violence. They agreed to pay Morrison descendants $2.3 million, calculated based on current land value plus compensation for lost business income. But for Keisha, the money wasn't most important. "It's the acknowledgement," she said at a press conference. "For 142 years, my family's story was erased. Ruth Morrison was written out of history. Now the truth is on record." The settlement included one provision Keisha had insisted upon. A historical marker would be erected where Ruth Morrison's home had stood, telling her story and acknowledging the violence she'd suffered. The marker was dedicated on a bright Saturday morning in June. Keisha was there along with dozens of Morrison family descendants who'd traveled from across the country. Ruth Cole, now 119 years old, attended in a wheelchair, accompanied by nurses and family. Marcus and Jennifer stood nearby as the marker was unveiled. It read, "On this site stood the home of Ruth Ellen Morrison, 1852-1903, a free black woman who purchased this property in 1879 and operated a successful seamstress business. On September 14, 1883, Ruth Morrison's home was burned in an arson attack orchestrated by Thomas Whitfield, who sought to steal her land. Ruth's mother, Ella Morrison, died in the fire. Ruth Morrison saved her daughter, Sarah Ruth Morrison, by sending her to safety with a locket containing proof of her identity. Ruth Morrison survived and rebuilt her life in Washington, D.C., but never recovered her stolen property. This marker honors her courage, resilience, and the legacy she left through her descendants. May her story remind us that justice, though long delayed, must never be forgotten." Ruth Cole asked to be wheeled close. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the engraved letters of her great-grandmother's name. "She existed," Ruth said softly, tears streaming down her face. "She mattered. She's remembered." Keisha knelt beside her great-grandmother's wheelchair, holding her hand. "Because of you, you never gave up. You kept her story alive." "Because of your mother," Ruth corrected gently. "Sarah wore that locket every day. She sat for that photograph to document it. She spent her life searching for truth. And now, finally, it's told." The dedication ceremony included speeches from local historians, civil rights leaders, and descendants of other families who'd lost property to racist violence. Each speaker emphasized that Ruth Morrison's story wasn't unique. Thousands of black families had been robbed of property and prosperity through violence and fraud in the decades after emancipation. "But Ruth Morrison's story gives us hope," one speaker said, "because her daughter preserved the evidence, because her great-granddaughter never gave up, because historians cared enough to investigate. Justice was finally served, even 142 years later. That shows us it's never too late to tell the truth." After the ceremony, people gathered around the marker, taking photographs, reading the inscription, discussing what they'd learned. Children asked their parents questions about slavery, emancipation, and why someone would burn a person's home. Marcus watched families engage with the history, seeing understanding dawn in people's faces. This was why documentation mattered. This was why preserving evidence mattered. Without Sarah's locket, without the photograph, without Ruth Cole's determination, Ruth Morrison would have been completely erased from history. One more victim whose story was never told. But now her name was carved in stone. Now her story would be told to every person who passed this spot. Now she was remembered. 6 months after the marker dedication, Ruth Peterson Cole died peacefully in her sleep at age 120. She'd lived long enough to see her great-great-grandmother's story told, to witness justice served, and to know Ruth Morrison's name would be preserved. Keisha called Marcus the morning Ruth died. "She was ready," Keisha said quietly. "She told me last week she'd finally finished what her mother started. She said she could rest now." "She was remarkable," Marcus said. "Living 120 years, never giving up. I'm honored to have known her. She wanted you to have something, the locket. She said you gave Ruth Morrison her voice back, and she wanted you to keep it safe at the museum for future generations." Ruth's funeral was held at First Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., the same church where Ruth Morrison had found sanctuary in 1883. The service celebrated Ruth Cole's extraordinary life, but also honored 4 generations of women who'd fought to preserve their family's truth. After the funeral, Marcus and Jennifer returned to the museum for one final task: installing the locket in a permanent display. The museum had created a special case in the main hall where the most significant artifacts were kept. The locket would rest there alongside other objects that told essential truths about Black American history. Marcus opened the velvet pouch and carefully lifted out the locket. In the museum's lighting, the silver gleamed despite its age. He could see the engraving clearly. R.M., Ruth Morrison's initials, carefully marked so her daughter would always know whose love had saved her. He opened the locket one last time before it would be sealed in the case. Inside, the tiny photograph of Ruth Morrison gazed back, a young woman with clear eyes and dignified expression. Beneath it, the birth certificate: Sarah Ruth Morrison, born March 15, 1881, freeborn. Marcus placed the locket in its display case, positioning it so the photograph and certificate would be visible. Beside it, the museum placed the 1889 photograph of the Williams family, with young Sarah wearing the locket. The display text read, "This locket belonged to Ruth Ellen Morrison, 1852-1903, who purchased property in Virginia in 1879. When her home was burned in 1883, Ruth saved her daughter Sarah by placing this locket around her neck. The locket contained Sarah's birth certificate and Ruth's photograph, proof of Sarah's identity. Sarah wore this locket daily for 70 years, honoring her mother and preserving evidence. Through 4 generations, Ruth Morrison, Sarah Williams Peterson, Ruth Peterson Cole, and Keisha Williams, this locket became a voice speaking truth across time." Marcus stepped back, looking at the completed display. A young black girl, maybe 10 years old, stood close to the case, studying the locket intently. Her mother read the display text aloud. "Why did she keep wearing it?" the girl asked. "If it made her sad?" "Because remembering was important," her mother said, "even when it hurt. She wore it to honor her mother's courage and make sure the truth wasn't forgotten." The girl nodded slowly, pressing her hand against the glass. "Her mother saved her." "Yes, and then she saved her mother's story." Marcus walked through the museum's galleries, past displays documenting slavery, emancipation, Reconstruction, and ongoing struggles for justice. Ruth Morrison's story fit into that larger narrative, one thread in the complex tapestry of Black American history. Outside, the sun was setting over Washington. Marcus stood on the museum steps, thinking about Ruth Morrison, a woman who'd been erased from history, whose property had been stolen, whose life had been destroyed. But she had not been silenced. Because of one locket, one photograph, and 4 generations who refused to let her story die, Ruth Morrison's voice still spoke, and the world was finally listening.